Well, good morning everyone. Hope everyone's doing well. I am back again. So, I'm back with the book again. I almost forgot about this, I'm not going to lie. I was about to start an XCOM stream. I'll have to start that after this. I'll link that in the description below. You'll find me on Twitch. Though I will be clear, if you do come onto Twitch, I would advise you to respect the main rule on there, which is no politics on Twitch. Because on Twitch, we're about having a good time on there. We can worry about the politics side of things on YouTube, yeah? Oh, I needed that. Right. Without further Mountain Dew, though, let's get the show on the road. So I believe I remember where I left off. But I will read from a bit further up, just in case anybody has missed it. So we're on page 10 right now, and it is the fascist state. Unpaid snoopers are everywhere. The population has been so brainwashed that they think the unelected EU electoral interference in the USA, the EU telling Musk what questions he can ask in a political interview in a foreign country, isn't fascism. But watch how silent amnesty interview in a... Oh, sorry, what? It's because I'm reading off different lines. But watch how silent amnesty and other British human rights organisations will be when the fascist state comes after Tommy Robinson. Charities like Amnesty and Liberty are not going to risk their tax-exempt status, their indirect funding from the fascist state. Their funding isn't at risk if they support Islamic terrorists or paedophiles or those who murder children. In case the network of informants in fascist Britain is not reliably fascist enough, we are told secretive COVID-era spy agency are brought in again to monitor social media during riots. Yes, you were the threat to be spied upon during COVID, when the fascist state locked you in your home and coerced you into taking genetic engineering disguised as a vaccine. Your blood always will be. Anyway, you are again a threat to be spied upon as the fascist state's intended tribal conflict breaks out on the streets. The fascist state is also deploying AI to automate the monitoring, brainwashing, and thought crimes of the public at scale. As one of the government's contractors says, AI technologies have been proven to be capable of detecting misinformation at this scale. You can be sure that their hate crime data and their AI models ignore the systematic hatred towards non-Muslims to be found in the doctrines and history of Islam, and the class war of the communist anarchists will also be excluded from such hate crime. Racial hatreds against the indigenous people will also not be monitored. The amazing thing is that after Rachel Reeves predicted in 2016 that mass immigration would bring about riots, it was another 8 years before the public anger boiled over. We have enormous amounts of evidence for the fascist state ignoring the hate crimes perpetrated by the mascots of the fascist state. Peter McLaughlin's book Easy Meat was first published in 2014, but it was ignored by all the institutions which were exposed in the book for their complicity with racist rapes on an industrial scale, and then the book was banned by Amazon. Yet the evidence has grown and grown, but the English did not riot. Far worse riots than those in 2024 erupted in the UK in 2011. The police stood back and let the riots continue. It was said at the time the police had lost confidence in themselves, but in truth, it was because the 2011 rioters were mostly not the indigenous people of Britain, but were mascots of the fascist state. Some animals are more equal than others. That time, in areas of London, where indigenous Brits took to the streets to protect shops, the police didn't hold back from forcing the English off the streets. But armed immigrants who were protecting their shops were ignored by the police and praised as heroes by the journalists. That the police in Leeds in July 2024 ran away from a mascot group rioting shows that it is only when the white working class resort to violence that the police respond aggressively. And sometimes not even then, as we've seen firsthand. Read the reports about how the police treated BLM protesters in 2020, George Floyd's death, concern for London Black Lives Matter protests after violence breaks out, and compare with how they treat the white working class about the millions of people imported by the anti-democratic fascistic state. When BLM rioted, the fascist state concern was to protect the BLM from criticism. Reread that quoted headline carefully. In 2020, global corporations rushed to give money to BLM following riots, as Tucker Carlson pointed out. A riot, and I quote, "A riot is the voice of the unheard. You are hearing that message from virtually every American corporation right now. Every university, every major media outlet." End quote. You saw absolutely the opposite response when riots involved white people, because the fascist state and its global corporations are allied to their mascots. Bad behavior by their mascots is protected, promoted, and funded. Martin Luther King's defense of rioting, the voice of the unheard, hadn't stopped him being turned into a saint. When the left in the USA were on the side of the rioters, even though the rioters had set fire to the government buildings with people inside the buildings, TV journalists from major corporations such as CNN stood in front of buildings and cars set ablaze by the rioters and tried to gaslight the viewers by saying the devastation was a sign of mostly peaceful protests. Compare the damage caused by the peaceful BLM riots with the damage in the recent riots of the UK. Did politicians and journalists start demanding that people sharing the images of BLM on social media be jailed? The total cost in the UA for the mostly peaceful BLM riots was over $1 billion. The people who ran BLM became millionaires. When there were riots in Bradford in 2001, it was reported that 1,000 police were deployed and 300 police were injured with £27 million of damage. That would be about £100 million in 2024 currency. A famous socialist human rights lawyer argued that Muslims jailed for rioting should have been treated leniently because of their fear of racists. Yeah, real fear of racism, sure. So in one of the towns where Muslim gangs have been raping English schoolgirls for years, Muslims rioted because of a political protest was mounted against what was going on here, a protest which had been banned by the fascist state. Imagine that for 50 years Englishmen had been systematically raping Muslim girls and prostituting those girls, and all the time the police, journalists, politicians, feminists, anti-racists all covered up for those gangs raping Muslim girls. Imagine the scale of rioting and terrorism from Muslims then, since they were prepared to stroke number one, since they were prepared to riot against a mere political protest by white people, a protest that had already been banned. But even the riots by the mascot groups are covered up and excused, just as other crimes they commit. What did the Englishmen do in response to decades of state complicity with these Muslim grooming gangs? Englishmen tried political protests, but even those legitimate protests were stamped on by the fascist state, looking after its mascots of diversity. No terrorism, no riots from the Englishmen. They just kept on campaigning and protesting. To this day, the elite are in denial about their complicity with 50 years of enabling immigrants to rape English schoolgirls. When a public inquiry was finally performed, every other form of child abuse was stuffed into the inquiry to bury what the Muslim grooming gangs had done and to conceal the complicity of the fascist state. The fascist state, as an act of public shaming, televised the sentencing of people who pled guilty to public disorder in August 2024. Something that was never done with the trials of the Muslim gangs who spent decades raping English schoolgirls. When those Muslim gangs finally started to be prosecuted, you saw how year after year the new media covered up the trials, only reporting briefly on the last day of the trial, often with the reporting confined to local news so the public wouldn't see the scale of the criminality. In Easy Meat in 2016, it was predicted that this was how the state would cover for its mascots. Tommy Robinson was jailed for reporting on one of the trials being concealed by the corporate news media. There was to be no public shaming for the grooming gangs because the public might start asking, what is it that makes Muslim men rape schoolgirls on an industrial scale when Englishmen are not targeting Muslim girls for rape? The corporate media of the fascist state report judge jailing men for violent disorder condemns twisted ideology behind rioting, when there was no evidence that the jailed men shared any ideology, but the Muslim rape gangs, united by Islam's scriptural hatred towards non-Muslims, us dirty kafar, were never accused of sharing a twisted ideology. When rioters caused £400 million of damage in 2011, the worst week of public disorder to hit Britain for 200 years, the left bent over backwards to excuse the riots because of government austerity. A 53-year-old woman with no history in criminality, someone who didn't even leave her home, was jailed for 15 months in August 2024, reportedly for writing "Don't protect the mosques, blow the mosques up with the adults in it." I have to stop this for a moment because I have to make this absolutely clear. I do not condone that kind of act. I do not condone blowing up the Bell End mosques, the Bell End churches, if you will. I do not condone that, and I will never advocate for anybody to do that shit. She was in the wrong for this one, so can't really say, oh, she was wrongly persecuted for it. Anyway, back on point. By contrast, mosques are funded by the UK government to hand out the Quran, which commands, kill the unbeliever. Clearly, the incitements to murder in that book are above the law, even when Muslims go and slaughter people to conform with the commands of the book. To Muslims, they are commands from God. Nobody should be inciting violence or murder, but the legality of the Quran is blatant proof of a two-tier justice system. Do the commands of a 53-year-old housewife carry more authority than the commands of an all-powerful Allah? Why is the Quran not banned as incitement to murder? MI5 terror watch list is 90% Muslim, even though Muslims are supposedly 6% of the population. For every one of those 40,000 terrorist suspects who attended a mosque, there is probably not one terrorist suspect in Britain who is a regular churchgoer. If the 94% in the UK who are not Muslims were given to terrorism, then there would be an additional 750,000 or so non-Muslims on the terror watch list. How are the chattering classes so blind that they cannot see this? We all know about the Muslim grooming gangs, even though the fascist state and its journalists do all they can to suppress the information. Here's the same question, framed another way. Where are the Muslim or Hindu girls groomed and raped by gangs of indigenous men? All things being equal, for every Muslim grooming gang, there should be about 19 non-Muslim grooming gangs. After all, aren't we indigenous men just feral scum compared to the wonderful immigrants? Again, the chattering classes want people not to understand this. That housewife's encouragement to destroy a mosque, potentially killing the people inside, resulted in jail, understandably. Yet all these government-funded mosques are handing out government-funded books where Allah is commanding his followers to kill non-Muslims. And in the UK, the Quran has resulted in 40,000 of those followers being on the terror watch list. And that number will surely double every generation. If you want any evidence of a two-tier justice system, here it is. The only doctrine allowed to command murder is Islam, and the fascist state rewards those who praise and defend Islam. The so-called Islamists and jihadis are identified as Muslim, but the elite fools millions of ignorant people that somehow Muslims and jihadis read a different Quran. When Muslims and Hindus rioted over a period of weeks in the English town of Leicester in August and September 2022, politicians and journalists did describe those immigrant rioters as far-right thugs. Once again, the police had a softly approach. Despite the widespread disorder involving hundreds of people over the weekend, officers only made 20 arrests in total, to add to the 27 already arrested in the 2 weeks after August 28. There is no doubt that the number of people taken into custody could have been much higher, with 16 police officers suffering injuries in the violence on Saturday night alone. The BBC was referring to these weeks of violence, at least 8 separated days of disorder, with multiple arrests of men in possession of weapons, as a large-scale disorder. The Guardian described it as a serious disorder, attributing the riots to the result of a cricket match between India and Pakistan, a match played in Dubai. Whilst going gently with these rioters, police called on the unelected community leaders, i.e. the Islamic leaders, to solve problems of violent disorder. Did anyone see the police calling on unelected community leaders in Southport, Rotherham, etc., etc.? Pardon me. When there were... That was the stroke number 2. When there was disorder from the indigenous British people, journalists were very quick to describe it as rioting, even when some of the weeks later on, only 3 people had been charged with rioting. The Leicester riots were sparked by a cricket match, not by week after week of news of reports of violent attacks by immigrants on the indigenous people in different parts of the country. The riots of August 2024 occurred in more than 25 towns in the UK, with 100 police officers injured, so about 4 officers per location. Meanwhile, in Leicester, 16 officers were injured in one night alone. But it doesn't have to be a riot of inglorious multicultural Britain. In August 2023, some 59 officers were injured at the Notting Hill Carnival, including 5 officers who were bitten. This is at a celebration carnival that is funded by taxpayers to the cost of untold millions of pounds each year. But because it's for a mascot group, there can be no criticism of such dangerous events. The only people the politicians and journalists smear as far-right and thugs are the indigenous working class Brits. In 2017, London Muslims mayor was saying that bomb attacks were just part and parcel of life in a big city. But by 2024, he was saying that riots in the summer of 2024 from the wider liberal democracy of Britain. I've read completely past that. But by 2024, he was saying riots mean I'm not as safe as a Muslim. What was the response to these riots in the summer of 2024 from the wider liberal democracy of Britain? My apologies. When Elon Musk said that civil war was inevitable in the UK, the response of the journalists of the fascist state was to urge politicians to ban Twitter/X. I'm going to put in my thoughts in here for a moment. Elon Musk is quite right. The cold, bitter truth is this country is heading towards a civil war, whether we want it or not. I think we are going to see a violent revolution, which I will say yet again, I do not want or advocate for or condone. But we are heading towards it. That's the cold, bitter truth. Even more so if Tommy Robinson gets killed. Fascists seek to have state control over the acts of individuals. It's the essence of fascism. The journalists of the fascist state love censorship because silencing dissent makes it easier for the journalists to fulfill their true stroke number 3. Fulfill their true professional calling, state propaganda. The fascist journalists were already outraged that years ago Musk bought Twitter and removed some of the fascist censorship that the previous elite running Twitter had put in place. For example, Musk unbanned former President Trump and unbanned Tommy Robinson. This tiny reduction in the fascist censorship in the West has earned Musk the enmity of the 1%. Journalists are part of the 1%, as we will show in chapter 3.11 below. The fascist state of Britain claims it has the power to jail citizens of other countries living outside of Britain for commenting on events in Britain. But the same fascistic state is prepared to make no efforts to stop criminal immigrants breaking through the borders of Britain. When the elite tell you we can control the climate, you better believe that when they bring millions and millions of immigrants into your country, then this is part of a policy shared by all political parties with more than just a handful of MPs. See Chapter 5 on population replacement. You must understand the people with power, the 1%, have no principles except to increase their power and wealth. That is all that motivates them. The anti-democratic fascist state not only runs a propagandist news media, but also the repressive power of police and criminal courts against dissenters. That there is a manipulated economy, extortion, taxation, and financial fraud to disperse funds and tax exemptions granted to the country, or to the groups who ally with the state. So-called charitable status. If the Charity Commission is not part of the fascist state, why is the database of charities hosted on GovDomain? You may find it shocking to contemplate the British state as fascist, but the events of the past few weeks have opened the eyes of millions of people. If you are in disbelief, you will need to read the rest of this book and the 1,200 references it contains. We are confident that your view of the world will never be the same. But here's a taster. Sir Oswald Mosley, whatever his name is, created the British Union of Fascists in 1932. But in the 15 years leading up to 1932, he was the darling of the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, and the Liberal Party. Each party wanted him to join them as an elected lawmaker. In 1968, Mosley wrote the Times newspaper to say that all of Britain's three major parties had for decades been implementing the fascist policies which he had put forward 35 years earlier. He said he had always been left-wing, and stroke number 4, it's not looking good, and that the policies he advocated for were now the centre ground of British politics. The elite used the bogeyman of fascism and the far right to fool the public into looking elsewhere for this fascist threat when the fascist state permeates all aspects of daily life. They smear fascism as far right, so they will be horrified to have their fascism exposed, because it shows that they are all far left, as was Mosley. There is basically no politics in Britain that can be described as right-wing, at least not since the Conservatives stabbed Thatcher in the back. Even the British National Party at times admitted they were National Socialists. It's socialism across the board. If they're not trying to destroy collectivism, then they are socialists. In Britain, the state controls how much you pay for energy and water, and compels you to fund the state broadcasters and propaganda, taxes almost everything you earn, and taxes almost everything you buy. It enforces your child's education. It controls what you can say, who you can transact with, and even compels you to say things that you know that are absolutely false. Islam is peace. A man with a beard is a woman. The fascist state controls which political parties can exist. It controls the universities, the doctors, and even most scientific research. Remember how many doctors, scientists, and ordinary people were censored over the origins of the COVID virus, over the treatment of COVID, over the dangers of the mRNA fake vaccine. We cover this in chapter 4.3. The politicians, journalists, and big businesses are all part of the fascist corporate state, and they are the enemy of individual freedom and the enemy of truth. You have probably never thought of Britain as fascist, but for many experts in the first half of the 20th century, British socialism was seen as the inspiration of fascism. 3.3 below. Nothing that goes against the fascist state gets funded from the money the state extorts from you. When Trotskyist organisations are funded as charities by the state, it means that they are working for the fascist state, even when they claim to be anti-fascist. As Oswald Mosley said in 1932 of the essence of fascism, all within the state, none outside the state, none against the state. The fascist state of Britain taxes everything and then gives tax exemptions to the political and cultural organisations that protect the fascist state. The state would not fund the English Defence League, the mission statement of the EDL can be seen in Appendix 4, but the fascist state accords charitable status to such self-styled anti-fascist organisations such as Hate Not Hope. Hope Not Hate. Or maybe I was right first time. Deception is everywhere. The fascist state wants you to think it is a sheep instead of a wolf. It uses guard dogs to herd the sheep in the direction that the fascist state wants the sheep to go. And, as Mosley says on the same page as the previous quotation, so soon as anybody steps outside those limits set by the fascist state, the mechanism of the corporate system descends upon him. He is subordinated to the welfare of the community as a whole and to the overriding authority of the organised state. To further suppress freedom of speech and freedom of thought, the fascist state in Britain introduced the apparently caring Online Safety Act. Supposedly introduced to protect children, with its command that internet companies remove content which is harmful but not illegal. The message of the bill is simple: take down exactly the content the government wants taken down. Now the concept of legal but harmful is being used to tell intranet companies to remove videos of the riots in the UK. As Mosley said, you are to be subordinated to the welfare of the community as a whole, and the fascist state will decide what is harmful. But the fascist state has to find elaborate ways to conceal from the public that it is fascist. So it uses the terms fascist and far right to denigrate its enemies under the caring fascist state. Free speech champion Musk would be forced to remove his own post warning that civil war is inevitable. You are not to be warned about what the state has set in motion. Every state-funded mosque can hand out free books commanding the believers to kill the unbelievers. Elon Musk had some years stepped outside the limits set by the fascist state, so the corporate system descended upon him. When he bought Twitter and asserted his belief in free speech, dozens of international corporations created a front organization to prevent anyone with money from advertising on Twitter in an attempt to drive Twitter out of business. In Britain, the corporate news media want the government's Ministry of Truth, Ofcom, another corporate body, to punish Musk, and the state police, a corporate body, threatened that Musk and others would face extradition and jail in Airstrip 1, the name Orwell gives to Britain in his novel 1984. If this is the pressure the fascist state puts on one of the richest people in the world, imagine the pressure exerted to intimidate ordinary people. It is little wonder, therefore, that most people prefer to believe comforting lies than uncomfortable truths. Notice how I sometimes say the cold, bitter truth. Anyway, people preferring to occupy themselves with gambling, drugs, and OnlyFans will find those things are unobtainable when the fascist state decides they are against the welfare of the community. For the moment, they are useful to the fascist state. The chattering classes care far more that male and female whores on OnlyFans should be allowed to profit from broadcasting sex acts than they care about the freedom of speech of those warning about the rape of schoolgirls and the terrorism that is fundamental to Islam. At the time when Mosley chose the socialism of dictator Mussolini to the socialism of dictator Joseph Stalin in Brave New World, 1932, how the elite would use drugs and sexual pleasure to distract the masses from our subjugation. It was stroke number 5, man alive. It was the Thatcher Revolution that set about destroying the fascist state, implemented by the political parties, who in the 1920s scrambled to have Mosley join them. The fascist state responded to this threat by removing Thatcher, the most successful party leader in the history of British politics. She won 3 landslide victories in succession before being stabbed in the back by her own party. When a Conservative party stabs in the back their most successful PM in the world, or in history, you must regard it as a political earthquake and ask yourself, why would an organisation destroy the most successful leader of what had been the most successful political party in history? After destroying Thatcher, the fascist state then set about destroying the British people for having derailed the fascist project all the parties had spent decades implementing. A shocking claim. But just look at the eye-opening evidence of Appendix 1. Our book will explain the politics of power behind these extraordinary events. Of course, none of this is what you've been told before, but then you're also forced to say that a man with a beard is a woman. The Conservative Party has banged on the reputation of Thatcher ever since they stabbed her in the back. But from the perspective of 2024, it looks like the public is never again going to trust Conservatives or Labour. Those who are aligned with the fascist state benefit from the fascist state, as demonstrated in the book Hitler's Beneficiaries, how the Nazis bought the German people. In the same way, the elite who run liberal democracies such as Britain find mechanisms to fund and reward specific mascot groups who ally with the state. People who don't understand the successes of fascism are people who are simply not looking at the groups allied with the state and how they benefit from the fascist state, such as all the self-proclaimed anti-fascist groups in receipt of state funding. The groups allied with the fascist state can inflict violent hatred on groups identified by the fascist state as the enemy with no repercussions for the criminal behavior of the mascot group. The rule of law is for the criminal behavior, is for something that doesn't apply to the mascots. But wait until the black anti-slavers find out that their enslavement under Sharia is ordained by Allah. See Ronald Segal's book, Islam, Black Slaves. The irony is that while the fascist state and state-funded anti-racists focus on destroying historical monuments in Britain and the USA, Islamic enslavement has returned to North Africa due to the actions of the anti-racist liberal democracies of Britain, France, etc., in 2011. In an age when it was never easier to understand what is going on in the world of highly educated anti-racists, are encouraged to focus on the myth of systemic racism in the West rather than care about black Africans being enslaved and sold in huge numbers. Modern-day Islamic slave markets just on the edge of Europe. The fascist state goes out of its way to control what the masses can say and what they think and what they can even perceive. Don't believe us? There are numerous reports in the 21st century return of Islam's black slaves, but we suspect most of you know nothing about this. There will be a list coming up very shortly. Just give me a moment. Oh, that lemon sip is lovely. Anyway, Libya migrant slave market footage sparks outrage. BBC 2017. The Libyan slave trade has shocked the world. Time 2017. People for sale. Well, lives are auctioned for $400. CNN 2017. Migrants from West Africa being sold in Libyan slave markets. The Guardian 2017. Executions, torture, and slave markets persist in Libya. Reuters 2018. Migrants captured in Libya say they end up sold as slaves. NPR 2018. Inside the modern slave trade, trapping African migrants. Time 2019. In Libya, migrants pay smugglers to get them to Europe. Instead, they are tortured, raped, and killed. Irish Times 2020. The black refugees you see getting to Italy, to France, and across the English Channel are those lucky enough not to be taken as slaves when they have passed through Islamic North Africa. The trade in black slaves was brought back to the borders of Europe by the meddling in foreign countries by anti-racist Obama, Hillary Clinton, Lord David the Conman Cameron, French President Sarkozy, NATO, and the EU in 2011. Libya, Obama, Cameron, Sarkozy vow Gaddafi must go. The fascist state gets the public to focus on anything but the fascist state's crimes against humanity, such as the crimes they committed in attacks on Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, etc. If you visited Google Trends and compare public interest from 2011 to 2022 relating to the search phrase George Floyd compared with slave market Libya, you will find that there was zero interest in the return of Islamic enslavement of black people. Organizations like Black Lives Matter, Hope Not Hate, etc., are just state-funded communist organizations manipulating public opinion on behalf of the fascist state. Don't for a moment think there's anything but a sliver of difference between communists and fascists. See chapter 3.3 and 5.4. Stalin would denounce Trotsky as fascist. Trotsky would denounce Stalin as fascist. Because these two leaders are the Bolshevik Revolution, were only heretics to each other on small issues relating to the broader topic of tyrannical socialism, on which they are united. The educated, woke young activists in Britain will spend £200 for a ticket to a Beyonce concert complaining about racist Britain, and go on marches supporting Hamas slaughtering Jews. But the woke activists do nothing about modern-day Muslims in Libya implementing Islam by enslaving black people. The educated, woke idiots don't know they are marching for Islamic fascism. Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood, which a jihadist organization modelled on all three supposedly different socialist totalitarian ideologies: Mussolini's fascism, Hitler's Nazism, and Stalin's communism, as members of the Muslim Brotherhood admitted. So these woke idiots end up on protests in support of Muslims killing Jews, alongside Muslims doing Nazi salutes, with no idea this connection to Nazism has reignited the genocidal jihad of groups like Hamas for the last century. Islamic slavery of blacks is happening not far from civilization in Rome, Spain's Costa del Sol, Ayia if that's how it's pronounced, sorry if I've butchered it, Tel Aviv, yet the woke will riot about a drugged-up, violent black criminal dying while resisting arrest, but they won't lift a finger to help legions of black slaves currently being tortured, raped, and killed under Sharia slavery laws. The state-funded anti-fascist organisations in Britain, allied with the state-funded Islamic organisations, proclaimed years ago that the 50 years in which the Muslim gangs have been systematically raping English schoolgirls was a racist myth. Yeah, well, we all know how that turned out. The current socialist Prime Minister of the UK is known appropriately as Two-Tier Keir, or in my eyes, Keir the Traitor Starmer, for his two-tier legal system exempting from criminal justice the mascots of the fascist state. Thus, the state and its allies constantly shriek about racism and the far right as a distraction from their own fascism and anti-white racism. The fascist state finds that the educated virtue signalers are so easy to manipulate because it's been doing this manipulation for many decades. And what passes for education is in reality brainwashing. The programmed virtue signalers say, ban those racist books which expose that the Quran incites violent hatred, with apparently no awareness of their insane contradictions. With their racism of low expectations, they expect immigrants to be full of hatred, and so the hate speech of the Quran needs to be protected. They think hatred is just fine, provided it's the indigenous people who are hated. And then they profess to be against hatred. There's more logical consistency to be found in Alice in Wonderland. The book in your hands, or in my hands, could have been called the Anti-Manifesto, because the political system they call representative democracy is corrupt to its core. Politicians present a manifesto, but the political parties share plans between them, and they spend decades implementing, regardless of the name of the party that wins any particular election. If that sounds unbelievable, consider Britain's entry to the European Union. If that's the plans for the United States of Europe were drawn up by 1930, but in Britain the public was deceived that it was just a free trade zone. And now this is where we start to get into bits that I know about. No, I haven't read this shit. I'm just looking at it right now, but I know about this stuff because I did do some research into it. But back to the book. When Britain was taken into the European Economic Community, this move, which turned out to be the biggest constitutional change since Parliament beheaded the King in 1649, this admission to the anti-democratic European superstate was barely even mentioned in the 1970 general election. Within weeks of the election, the winning Conservative Party began the process of subjugating the British people to the European Union dictatorship. Or again, maybe I was right first time. The EU is run by unelected community, the Commission. Maybe you are unconvinced that the elite spent 90 years planning and lying to the voters about the EU, so let us consider planning immigration, which Party Manifesto said, we will put in motion a policy of population replacement so that by the centenary of the Second World War, you will be an ethnic minority in your own country. We will show, Chapter 5, or below, Chapter 5, Population Replacement, that these anti-democratic changes were planned in public, but with the public being systematically deceived by those with power. The fascist state cannot allow masses to realise how anti-democratic it is. The EU pretends it is interested in freedom and democracy, but this is a pretense. Maybe you know enough about fascism to say, but one of the core economic policies of the fascist control was trade barriers. What is the fundamental basis of the European Union? Trade barriers. The so-called customs union. And the elite who control the UK were desperate to be part of this customs union. After the Brexit referendum, the pro-EU politicians in the UK were still desperate to remain in this customs union, to have trade barriers just as fascism commends. And that will be all for today. 40 minutes of reading, another 10 pages down, and I will keep reading this for as long as it takes. But yes, there's a lot to digest in there, isn't it, folks? And obviously, I will keep reading this book, and my prayers and thoughts are with Tommy Robinson, as always, who is currently serving time in HMP Woodhill now, because they decided, after giving him reassurances that he was going to be safe in Belmarsh, basically the government lied, and they moved him towards the punishment wing in HMP Woodhill. So I wish Tommy Robinson well, and this is blatantly an attempt to mess with Tommy Robinson's mental health and his physical well-being. And we need to call this treachery out for what it is. So let's hope that we can stick it to Keir the traitor Starmer whenever another protest comes up. Or maybe he'll stick himself. Who knows? But one thing is for sure, as I've said, if Tommy Robinson is killed in prison, there will be a violent revolution.